This is Scott Iman, and I'd like to welcome you to a beautiful restoration of Herbert Brenon's The Spanish Dancer. First things first, the restoration derives from 4 different prints of the film. 1, a tinted 35mm nitrate print from the Eye Film Institute in the Netherlands. 2, a black and white 35mm nitrate print from the Belgian Cinematheque. 3, a 16mm print from Photoplay Productions in London. 4, another 16mm print from Lobster Films. None of the prints were complete in themselves. The 16mm prints were of a cut-down version prepared for the home movie market, probably in the 1930s. That was the version I saw many years ago, not in the 1930s, I might add. The shooting script revealed that the Netherlands print contained about 64% of the original film, while the Belgian print was about 62% of the original. But luck was with the restorers. The missing scenes in the Netherlands print were in the Belgian print, and vice versa. What all this means is the film you're about to see contains about 95% of the material indicated in the shooting script. The opening scene and most of the location work was shot on the Lasky Ranch on the border of Hollywood and what became Burbank. The Lasky Ranch has a storied history of its own. It consisted primarily of rolling hills, a lot of trees, and some running water. The Lasky Ranch was where D.W. Griffith shot the battle scenes for The Birth of a Nation, where Rex Ingram shot the locations for The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, where Harold Lloyd shot The Kid Brother. The ranch was a popular location because in that era most of the movie studios were located in and around Hollywood, which meant in practice that they had small back lots. The primary exception was MGM in Culver City, where they had a huge back lot. But Paramount in 1923 was right by Hollywood and Vine, so if they needed locations for a picture that indicated open country, the Lasky Ranch was the go-to location. In 1952, the Lasky Ranch underwent massive regrading and was converted into Forest Lawn Hollywood. So, if you ever visit Forest Lawn with its acres of honored dead, you're also visiting the locations for a slew of famous movies. 2 writers are credited for the screenplay, June Mathis and Beulah Marie Dix. Mathis did the first draft when the picture was planned as a vehicle for Rudolph Valentino. This assignment made perfect sense. Mathis had written The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the Rex Ingram film that made Valentino a star, as well as The Conquering Power, a succeeding collaboration between Ingram and Valentino. After that, Valentino left Metro and Ingram and signed with famous players Lasky, where Mathis wrote Blood and Sand for him. But Valentino got into a dispute with famous players Lasky over artistic control of his films and walked out on his contract. At that point, famous players decided to go ahead with The Spanish Dancer, but shift the starring part to the female lead. At that point, Beulah Marie Dix was called in to do a new draft. There's Wallace Beery wearing the worst wig in the film, which is saying something. If you can get past Beery's wig, you're home free. It'll become obvious as you watch the movie that Pola Negri, the star cast as the Spanish Dancer, was a true movie star, because she holds her own against 2 of the most ruthless scene stealers in Hollywood history, Wallace Beery and Adolphe Menjou. In 1923, Beery's career was ascending to the always rare ranks of the character actor as movie star. He'd been working in movies since before World War I and gradually gained momentum with Douglas Fairbanks as Robin Hood in 1921, where he played King Richard. He picked up speed when he signed with Paramount and played a long list of dominating roughnecks, including William Wellman's Beggars of Life with Louise Brooks. Interspersed with those were low-budget slapstick comedies in which he was co-starred with Raymond Hatton. Beery's career kicked into high gear with Sound and signing up with MGM. Sound revealed a voice that matched up perfectly with Beery's screen character. He spent the rest of his life at MGM, where he became one of the most profitable stars on the roster. Beery wasn't popular around the MGM lot. Basically, he was a sourpuss who thought nothing of stealing furniture from the sets of his films. But Louis B. Mayer liked Beery's profits, if not his personality. As Mayer said, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. For Adolphe Menjou, 1923 was also a very good year. Besides The Spanish Dancer, he starred in Charlie Chaplin's A Woman of Paris. In A Woman of Paris, Menjou played a cheerfully amoral but likable boulevardier, which gave him the parameters of the screen character he would play for the greater part of the next 30 years, most prominently in a long series of starring comedies at Paramount. Guile would always be a prominent part of Menjou's screen personality, right up to one of his last performances as a corrupt general in Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory. Menjou's right-wing politics would gradually conspire against a full appreciation of his acting skills. But for Herbert Brenon, For Chaplin, for anybody that hired him, Monjou was always an asset. Intelligent, witty, forceful, but never over the top, except when the part called for it, as in William Wellman's uproarious film, Roxy Hart. The Spanish Dancer can be viewed either as a pure product of the studio system as it was gathering momentum, or as a companion piece to the collaboration between Ernst Lubitsch and Mary Pickford in Rosita, recently restored by the Museum of Modern Art. That's because The Spanish Dancer and Rosita are based on the same story material, and the two pictures were released within a few months of each other. They are very different pictures nonetheless. Rosita is a good movie, one that Pickford consistently underrated because of the tension between the picture Pickford wanted to make to satisfy the expectations of her audience and the picture Lubitsch wanted to make. By comparison, The Spanish Dancer is all of a piece. It's a straight star vehicle, and frankly, it's more of an audience picture than Rosita. Because Famous Players Lasky, soon to change their name to Paramount Pictures, was an extremely efficient manufacturer of commercial movies. The star of the picture, as I said, is Pola Negri, the recently arrived actress the studio had imported from Germany, where she rose to stardom in a series of mostly delightful comedies and dramatic spectacles directed by, wait for it, Ernst Lubitsch. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get to it. To begin with, the source material for both The Spanish Dancer and Rosita is a play called Don Cesar de Bazan. It's a 5-act melodrama that premiered in 1844 and was based on a work by Victor Hugo. The play was well known because the title character had been played for years by Frédéric Lemaitre, one of the main characters in the legendary French film masterpiece, Children of Paradise. The play was highly popular in Europe and was translated in English and played by, among others, Edwin Booth. It was also converted into an opera by Jules Massenet. In the early silent days, the play was adapted for the movie several times, noticeably by the French Eclair Company in 1909, as well as the American Calum Company. The Spanish Dancer was the third starring picture Pola Negri made for Famous Players Lasky. She was born in 1897 as Barbara Apollonia Chaliapek in a small town in Poland. Her father was a tinsmith, and she was the sole surviving child of 3 born to her parents. By 1911, Pola was admitted to the Imperial Ballet School in Warsaw, but she contracted tuberculosis and was sent to a sanitarium in the Tatra Mountains of Poland. She was there for 3 months and spent a good deal of time in the sanitarium's library, where she became enthralled with the work of the Italian poet Ada Negri. She promptly adopted the poet's last name as her own. Tuberculosis had weakened her lungs, so she had to switch to a less physically strenuous branch of the theater, acting. She began making films around 1914, and from the beginning she projected a fiery, sensual temperament, which was an authentic component of her personality. This passionate approach to her work was part of her private life as well. Her big break arrived when she played the part of a dancing girl in a Berlin revival of Max Reinhardt's stage production of Sumarun, based on a story of the Arabian Nights. Also featured in the production were Emil Jannings and Ernst Lubitsch. Negri didn't like Jannings. She found him pompous and without humor, but she and Lubitsch hit it off and became best friends. She began appearing in German films in 1918, in films such as The Yellow Ticket and Mania, the story of a cigarette worker. Both films survive and prove that Negri was already Negri, fierce, passionate, an actress capable of seizing the screen. As for Lubitsch, he was also setting out in his own career as a director, appearing in a series of delightful films as Meyer, an aggressive, fumbling Jewish character. Lubitsch directing Negri was an obvious pairing, and the result was a trilogy of costume epics, The Eyes of the Mummy Ma, Carmen, and Madame du Barry. They were all hits in Germany, and surprisingly, they were all hits in America as well. I think they appealed to American audiences for one simple reason. Americans hadn't really seen an actress like Negri before. As Janine Basinger writes in her book, Silent Stars, audience were bowled over by, quote, Negri's strong sexuality, her fearless portrayals of passion, and her animal magnetism. Basinger goes on to say that she holds a viewer's attention, and she plays a fully developed character. In the silent era, glamour girls were usually one thing or another, good or bad. Stars were divided into those who scampered and those who simpered, the virgin or the whore. Negri in passion is everything. She's scintillating and extremely attractive, with the implication that men are drawn to her not for her decadence or for her erotic posturing, but for her impulsive, tarty sexuality, which they long to experience. She's unafraid of sex, and she makes it clear she wants it too." Close quote. It's no wonder that Negri created a sensation. Nobody else was doing this. During this period, Negri married for the first time and divorced for the first time as well. She and Lubitsch then collaborated on 3 more films: One Arabian Night, The Mountain Cat, and The Flame. And it was at this point that Hollywood came calling. Mary Pickford hired Lubitsch, famous players Lasky hired Negri. Both of them had a difficult initiation. Lubitsch struggled with both the language and the unfamiliar working environment of Hollywood, while Negri was typed as a femme fatale and handed to George Fitzmaurice for her first 2 films, Belladonna, followed by a remake of DeMille's 1915 masterpiece, The Cheat. With The Spanish Dancer, the studio decided to upgrade Negri's productions in terms of both budgets and directors. Publicity went out that Paramount spent $250,000 just on furnishings for the sets of The Spanish Dancer. It sounds high. On the other hand, the sets are spectacular. Paramount released publicity calling Negri the Goya woman, referring to her black hair and milky complexion. When Negri arrived on the lot, famous players Lasky already had a reigning female star. Her name was Gloria Swanson. There was a great deal of publicity around a supposed feud between the 2 divas. Audiences then and now are always eager to hear about an aura of off-screen tension between 2 movie stars. In this case, the catfights were supposedly literal. Photoplay magazine printed an item to the effect that Negri hated cats, while Swanson liked cats, and that Negri had ordered that all the strays hanging around the studio be gotten rid of. Swanson supposedly began feeding the cats just to irritate Negri. In fact, the catfight story was just a gag that got out of hand and was ginned up by the publicity department. For one thing, just how many stray cats could have been hanging around a bustling movie studio? Swanson and Negri weren't friends, but they weren't enemies either. When they both wrote autobiographies, they didn't have a bad word to say about each other. In many ways, they were sisters under the skin. Both of them had tempestuous private lives that had a way of getting in the way of their careers, and both of them believed implicitly in playing the part of the star off-screen as well as on. For instance, Negri bought a white Rolls Royce and would drive around Hollywood with white wolfhounds sitting on either side of her. Her chauffeur was also dressed in white. If it was raining, she wore black, although how the wolfhounds coped with the rain has fallen between the cracks of film history. Supposedly, Negri even had a pet tiger that was leash-trained, but that sounds like another whopper dreamt up by the publicity department. The problem with this kind of display is that it can easily obliterate the actual work of acting that it ostensibly supports. Hollywood was and is used to actors with attitude, but Negri took it to new levels. Harry Carr was a screenwriter and a writer for the fan magazines, and he described Negri as, quote, cruel, condescending, overbearing, humble, contrite, generous, sweetly reasonable, gracious with a charm that would disarm an ogre, disagreeable, ungracious, winning, forbidding. In other words, Negri is every kind of woman, according to the mood of the moment. Unquote. There are a great deal of similarities between Negri and Swanson. Both of their careers were essentially contained within the silent era. Swanson did have the astonishing curtain call of Sunset Boulevard in 1950, while Negri had to make do with working for UFA in the 1930s and a farewell spin with Walt Disney in the 1960s, playing a glamorous heavy in the Haley Mills vehicle, the Moonspinners. What is clear is that, unlike Swanson, Negri was given to displays of temperament on the set and wasn't particularly popular around the studio. Henry Hathaway was working as a prop man at Paramount before graduating to assistant director and finally director. Hathaway worked with Negri and said, quote, Pola Negri was a real character. She came on the set and there was a metal statuette of a peacock standing there, and she said, "Get that out of here." I explained that it had been in earlier shots and we couldn't move it. She yelled, "I'm telling you to get the goddamn thing out of here." And I said, "I'm telling you I won't move the goddamn thing." She picked it up and threw it at me, and it hit the wall behind me and broke into 1,000 pieces, and she yelled, "Fire him." She always talked about herself in the third person. She'd be looking at the Rushes eating hard-boiled eggs and swilling stuff, and a close-up of her would come on, and she'd go, "Shh, isn't she beautiful? Look at those eyes." Then it would cut to a two-shot, and she'd go on eating eggs, hard-boiled eggs, dark bread, and a bottle of something. Close quotes. I miss Henry Hathaway. One of the more dubious pleasures of the silent era is noticing how many of the leading men hired to work opposite female stars had zero personality. This was no accident. In the silent era, producers were interested in showcasing the name above the title star. If the name above the title was a woman, they seemed to go out of their way to cast actors with no discernible personality, but who looked decent in a tuxedo. An actor named Eugene O'Brien made 11 films opposite Norma Talmadge, in spite of the fact that he's an utter void on the screen. Mary Pickford was also guilty of this from time to time. In Rosita, Pickford's version of the Spanish Dancer, her leading man's George Walsh, the brother of director Raoul Walsh. He's good-looking, but he doesn't hold the screen, and he has much less to do in the Pickford picture than Antonio Moreno does in the Spanish Dancer. This practice persisted somewhat into the sound era when bland actors like George Brent would routinely be called into service opposite high-octane divas such as Bette Davis. It began to lessen when MGM routinely cast powerful leading men, Clark Gable for instance, opposite equally powerful leading women, Joan Crawford or Jean Harlow. It doubled the erotic power of a love scene, and the practice of routinely casting a non-entity opposite a stronger star gradually fell by the wayside. Negri must have been a fairly secure actress, because her leading man in this picture actually has a personality. Antonio Moreno was born in Madrid and entered the movies very near their infancy, 1911. Before that, he'd worked on the American stage, opposite such luminaries as Constant Collier and Tyrone Power Sr. He started doing extra work at the Biograph studio and reputedly appeared quickly in D.W. Griffith's The Musketeers of Pig Alley and An Unseen Enemy with the Gish sisters. He even played Shakespeare. He was the first Latin movie star in America, before Valentino, before Ramon Navarro. Moreno was starred opposite Gloria Swanson, Marion Davies, and of course, opposite Clara Bow in her signature film, It. He stayed a star throughout the silent era, working with Garbo in The Temptress and with Rex Ingram in Mare Nostrum, that director's last great film. Unless you were English, accents were a problem in the early days of sound, and Moreno was no exception. Also, there was the matter of his age. In 1930, when sound was hitting full speed, Moreno was 43 years old. His first sound films were opposite American stars. In Romance of the Rio Grande, he played the heavy opposite Warner Baxter, and in 1930 he made a movie called Rough Romance with George O'Brien, again as the villain. In the early sound era, before the advent of dubbing, Hollywood made alternate versions of their films for foreign markets. Generally, the film would be completely recast for French, German, or Spanish audiences. Other times, one or two of the primary actors would speak the language, while other parts would be recast with native speakers. So Moreno segued into playing starring parts for Spanish-language films, for Warner's, Fox, Universal, and Paramount. At Paramount, he made a Spanish version of the Benson murder case, a Philo Vance murder mystery that had starred William Powell in the English version. Of course, sometimes you don't win for losing. Moreno was criticized in Spanish newspapers because his Spanish had an American accent. Moreno was forced to admit that his accent was in fact Andalusian, not Castilian. Moreno also shot the Spanish version of The Cat Creeps, directed by Rupert Julian, who'd made The Phantom of the Opera. His co-star in The Cat Creeps was Lupita Tovar, who would marry the agent and producer Paul Kohner. In her memoirs, Tovar said Moreno's Spanish was rusty, but she said, quote, "He was charming and always looking out for me," unquote. In 1932, Moreno transitioned to directing in Mexico for a couple of pictures, then returned to Hollywood for more work making Spanish-language films at Fox. All that ended in 1935 when Fox merged with Darryl Zanuck's 20th Century Pictures to become 20th Century Fox, and Zanuck stopped production of Spanish-language pictures. After an unsuccessful film in Spain, Moreno returned to America in 1939, but he found little work. At the Margaret Herrick Library in Hollywood, there's a 1939 unemployment insurance form for Moreno. He had 2 jobs that year, one from Fox, one from Paramount. His total income was $1,416.67. After World War II, Moreno tried Mexico again, but he made only one film. Returning to America, his luck began to change. He picked up work in the lavish Tyrone Power swashbuckler The Captain from Castile and the Gary Cooper western Dallas. In the 1950s, he got good parts in good films: Crisis with Cary Grant and Ramon Navarro, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and most importantly, his last film, John Ford's The Searchers. One of the most attractive things about Ford was his habit of providing parts for forgotten veterans of the silent era, Mae Marsh, Billy Burke, Moreno, among many others. Moreno's hair was now white, but he looked magnificent, and he'd retained the authority that a character actor needed to work opposite John Wayne. It's a crucial scene that leads Wayne's Ethan Edwards to find Scar, the murderer he's been pursuing for 6 years. And there's one in-joke in the script. The name of Moreno's character in The Searchers is Emilio Gabriel Fernandez y Figueroa, a conflation of two of Ford's Hispanic friends, the great cinematographer Gabriel Figueroa and the director Emilio Fernandez. Antonio Moreno died in Beverly Hills in 1967. He was 79 years old. There's another small part actor that I'd like to mention. He plays a kind of semi-idiot who helps out Don Cesar from time to time, a couple times in the picture. He's an actor named Gareth Hughes, whose trajectory is unlike that of any other actor I know in silent films, or for that matter, sound films. Hughes was Welsh. He was a successful juvenile on the Broadway stage. He came to movies in 1918, and in 1921 he had a completely unexpected success in a famous Players Lasky movie based on a James M. Barrie story called Sentimental Tommy. Hughes seemed to be a star in the making, perhaps another kind of a version of Richard Barthelmess, a small, boyish, subtle actor who'd made a great success in Broken Blossoms and Tolerable David. But famous Players Lasky didn't quite know what to do with Hughes. His natural inclination was to play a highly emotional juvenile, and public taste ran towards more stoic characters. By the late 1920s, Gareth Hughes was reduced to appearing in Poverty Row pictures. Reputedly, Hughes lost what money he had in the 1929 stock market crash, and he went back to the theater. And here's where it gets interesting. In the late 1930s, he underwent a religious conversion and began calling himself Brother David. He spent the next 14 years of his life as a Christian missionary on a Paiute Indian reservation in Nevada. When his health began to fail, he returned to California. He died in the motion picture home in 1965. The life of Gareth Hughes could be the inspiration for a Coen Brothers film, or perhaps something much darker. Again, we're never going to know. In a movie like this, character actors are seasoning. The main meal is the stars. And that brings us back to Pola Negri. After arriving in Hollywood from Germany, Negri made quite a social splash. She had a brief affair with Charlie Chaplin, and they even announced their engagement, which lasted just about as long as their marriage would have. Negri would say that Chaplin was like a lot of comedians and that he had no sense of humor in his private life. A few years later, there was an affair with Rudolph Valentino that ended when Valentino died suddenly in August of 1926. Negri put on a lavish display of public mourning that seems to have alienated portions of the audience. She always spoke of Valentino in hushed tones, as in this remark, quote, "He loved to make spaghetti and meatballs. He had his own special recipe. I never tired of it, and I will never share with anyone else the secret of his meat sauce." Unquote. That is love. The odd thing about Negri is that the critics habitually complained that her American pictures were inferior to the German pictures that had made her reputation. Certainly Paramount could have done better out of the gate. Her second American picture, as I mentioned, was a remake of DeMille's The Cheat, and as with Belladonna, it was directed by George Fitzmaurice, who was no DeMille. Press reports at the time indicated that the Negri remake was greeted with laughter at its American premiere. But from the films that have survived from Negri's time at Paramount, it seems that overall the studio did quite well by her. The Spanish Dancer was her third picture for the studio and was a great improvement on the first two. The year after The Spanish Dancer, she made Forbidden Paradise, her only reunion with Lubitsch, who got more subtle shadings out of her than any other director. Of course, he got more subtle shadings out of most actors than any other director. Her leading man in Forbidden Paradise was Rod LaRocque, who actually was named Rod LaRocque, even though it sounds like a silent movie name, but that was really his name. LaRocque struck sparks with her off-screen as well. It's a delightfully dry comedy, probably Lubitsch's best silent film. He brings out Negri's knack for deadpan humor. Forbidden Paradise has recently been restored, and I hope it becomes widely available as soon as possible. With the hindsight of 100 years, it needs to be emphatically stated that Negri was by and large quite successful. From 1923 to 1928, she made 2 to 3 pictures a year for Paramount, and the studio wouldn't have kept her around for that long unless her movies were making money. And another thing, she's truly a marvelous actress. Exotic, lively, and, passionate. For a Negri in a different key, check out Malcolm St. Clair's film, A Woman of the World. It plays on all of her best qualities. It casts Negri as a countess trying to recover from a busted love affair by visiting relatives in a small town in the American Midwest. She gets off the train to find a sign, 127 miles to Des Moines, 210 miles to Davenport. After that, it's an amusing series of culture clashes. The town regards her as incredibly exotic, which she is, and she regards the townspeople as crude rustics, which they are. At one point, she becomes an attraction at the county fair, where a sign announces that for 25 cents, you can talk to a real countess. The only thing that can bridge the culture gap is, of course, a handsome man who unfortunately happens to be a moralistic district attorney. The film climaxes when Negri forces the attorney to submit by horsewhipping him. It's a genuinely sophisticated feminist comedy that Preston Sturges could have written, a comedy in which Negri never cracks anything wider than a sly smile. Taken all in all, she was close to the whole package, a sensual actress who could play drama or dry comedy with equal facility. There's no doubt that her career would have continued had sound not arrived beginning in 1927. As it happened, 1927 could be regarded as Negri's last good professional year. She made Hotel Imperial for Moritz Stiller and Barbed Wire for Roland V. Lee. These are 2 serious dramas distinguished both by their adult themes, their strong direction, and Negri's performances. She could be a handful for a director. Certainly, on Spanish Dancer, there was no love lost between Negri and her director. Negri complained that Herbert Brenon was competent but uninspired. What she ended up doing was trying to play her scenes the way she imagined Lubitsch would have asked her to play them. As for Brenon, he gave the impression that it was easier to tamp down a temperamental actor than it was to bring a placid actor up to the required level of intensity. Quote, Pola Negri is temperamental, but she has her temper under tight control. An actor without temperament is like a violin without strings. You can't play on either one of them. Close quote. Speaking of temperament, inevitably brings us to Herbert Brenon. Brenon was a major director in the silent era, semi-forgotten today. He made some fine pictures, but in some respects, he's more interesting than a lot of his movies are. He's a good storyteller, but his stylistic conservatism tends to work against a full appreciation of his storytelling gifts. He was born in Dublin in 1880 and worked in vaudeville before entering the movie business in 1912. He became a directorial notable in 1916 when he directed A Daughter of the Gods on location in Jamaica with the swimming star Annette Kellerman. The film utilized massive sets and thousands of extras and reputedly cost about $450,000, a huge amount for the time. After that, Brenon was off on a major run of success. After joining Paramount, he made a succession of hits. Besides A Spanish Dancer, there was Peter Pan, A Kiss for Cinderella, the now lost silent version of The Great Gatsby, and Beau Geste, starring Ronald Colman. These films were commercially and critically successful despite their high cost and their director's frequent explosions of temper. Frank Thompson reports in his book on Beau Geste's various permutations that Brennan's 1926 production cost more than $900,000, a whopping sum for the period. Beau Geste was shown on a roadshow basis and was a huge critical and commercial hit that was invariably named one of the 10 best pictures of what was a very strong year at the movies. Negri would never be one of Herbert Brenon's fans. She complained mightily about Brenon during production and ever afterwards. In her autobiography, this is the totality of her remarks about The Spanish Dancer. Quote, Herbert Brenon, a good but not inspired director, was assigned to my picture. I was fortunate in having 2 talented and dedicated actors, Antonio Moreno and Wallace Beery, playing the hero and the villain. Still, I felt that Mary Pickford had all the obvious advantage with Lubitsch. At the time, I was free of all emotional involvement and able to devote all of my energies to making ours the more outstanding film. It was fortunate that a spirit of friendly professional rivalry with Mary's company inspired our cast and crew, because they had a great deal to contend with. Brenon was a volatile and fastidious man who insisted that things be done only his way. I could not help seeing certain scenes as Lubitsch would have directed them. This resulted in many flare-ups that often held up work for an entire day. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the film turned out so well that when both Rosita and the Spanish Dancer were released, it resulted in both a complete artistic and financial victory for Negri and Brenon. And yes, she indeed refers to herself in the third person. Negri's reviews for the Spanish Dancer were indeed good, but some felt the film failed to live up to its leading lady. Photoplay wrote, "After being wasted in Belladonna and The Cheat, Pola Negri comes back to her own in this picture. She is again La Negri of passion. She portrays almost every emotion conceivably and does each and every one admirably." The Film Daily said that the film would please anybody who liked, quote, colorful romantic pictures, and the star appears to better advantage here than she did in either Belladonna or The Cheat. But Pola is still not doing the big things that she did under Lubitsch's direction. Close quote. Brenon, as was his wont, demanded absolute control over the picture and in the performances. Supposedly, Brenon caused a scar on Negri's face. Antonio Moreno was supposed to hurl a boot at her face, but a spur cut her close to her eye and demanded 12 stitches. And that, at least, was what the Paramount publicity department asserted. Brenon would stock out of Paramount after the great success of Beau Geste in 1926. The cause seems to have been a dispute over the budget for a movie Brenon wanted to make called Sorel and Son. It had been a best-selling novel, and Brenon wanted to shoot it on location in England, where the story took place. Jesse Lasky thought that was a needless extravagance, so Brenon left Paramount and took Sorel and Son to United Artists. After that, he directed a film called The Rescue for Sam Goldwyn, also released through United Artists. After making a picture called Lummox for UA, Brenon signed with RKO, which hailed his coming with ads proclaiming Brenon as, quote, one of radio's pageant of titans, a creator of drama that grips and invigorates. He has set an unfaltering standard of merit with such shows as Peter Pan, The Great Gatsby, Beau Geste, Sorel and Son, and The Rescue. And now the lure of opportunity has brought Herbert Brenon to radio pictures to give still greater scope to his genius through the magic medium of electrical entertainment. Unfortunately, Brenon had a catastrophe on a picture called Beau Ideal, a semi-sequel to Beau Geste. Initially, he cast Douglas Fairbanks Jr. as his star, but after 2 days, Fairbanks left the picture because he clashed with Brenon over how his character should be played. He was replaced by someone named Lester Vale, who only made a few movies before going back to the New York stage. Vale, as well as the other actors in the film, responded with highly theatrical performances. It seems that Brenon was overly addicted to the tropes of silent movies. On Beau Ideal, he maintained a group of musicians that had played during scenes with actors in the silent days to create the emotional mood of a given scene. On Beau Ideal, the little mini orchestra played for rehearsals in between takes to maintain a proper mood. It struck everyone at RKO as a useless affectation left over from the silent days. Frank Thompson, in his book on Beau Geste, reports that Beau Ideal lost more than $300,000. I've seen the movie, and I can tell you it deserved to lose every cent it took to make. Soon thereafter, Brenon went to England, where he made a series of varying pictures that failed to maintain his already faltering career momentum. In 1940, he came back to Hollywood and found nothing. He never got another directing job. So, Herbert Brenon became another director destroyed by sound, along with other A-list silent filmmakers such as Fred Niblo, James Cruise, and Rex Ingram. Ingram was increasingly bored with the movie business, and he might have been headed for the exit anyway. But Niblo, Brenon, and Cruise were beloved by studios and respected by critics. Their movies made money, they had the first pick of commercial properties and stars, and they were given a great deal of autonomy. And within a few years after sound arrived, all of their careers were either over or relegated to B-movies. Poor Fred Niblo was saddled with John Gilbert in Redemption, one of the actor's first talkies. The picture endured reshoots directed by Lionel Barrymore, who proved to be his hopeless as a director as he was an actor. MGM realized they had a stiff on their hands, so they decided to hold back redemption and make another picture as Gilbert's first release talkie. That was His Glorious Night, also directed by Barrymore, whom Gilbert must have found more congenial than Niblo. It also was a critical disaster. There was nothing really wrong with Gilbert's voice, despite the legend that's come down in the preceding century, but there was nothing terribly right about it either. It was slightly nasal and he didn't have any chest tones. It would have been a fine voice for a light, ironic actor like Robert Montgomery, but it was not what the audience imagined Gilbert sounded like. And this was key. Actors in silent movies had no specific identity. They lived the emotional lives that audiences chose to project onto them. In contrast, sound literally forced actors to declare themselves, to define their personalities, their relationships to each other, and most importantly, their relationship to the audience. The gap between imagination and reality, not to mention the fact that most of Gilbert's talkies were dreary programmers when all the best MGM scripts and co-stars were being handed to Clark Gable, sealed his fate. Rex Ingram made only one talkie, Baroud, a beautifully shot Foreign Legion romance that Ingram made in Morocco. Ingram also played the lead in a silent movie. His black Irish good looks would probably have made the picture a success. But in sound, his flat, awkward phrasings made the film's setting, which was in itself a clear throwback to Ingram's silent pictures, a humiliating financial failure. Mainly, silent movies and sound movies were two completely different mediums. Silent movies were inherently artificial, given to romance and physical display, like, well, The Spanish Dancer. Talkies were inherently more realistic. Silence abstracted stars and stories that had a way of making actors seem younger than they really were. Sound reversed that equation and demanded an entirely different manner. The stars made by sound were people like James Cagney, Edward G. Robinson, not to mention Carole Lombard and Barbara Stanwyck. None of these people would have been particularly effective in silent pictures. They were sassy actors who'd seen it and done it all, and they were more than capable of talking about it. Sound was the first wave in an onslaught of surface reality that would eventually make movies a slave to the most prosaic elements of objective reality before the pendulum swung back to the 21st century norm of emphasizing fantasy. Changing times can have a way of rendering people unemployed, but I suspect part of Herbert Brenon's problem was his irascible temperament. People will put up with that when the money's flowing, but when the money stops, so can the congenial atmosphere. Edmund Burns was one of the early sound technicians lifted out of radio and brought to Hollywood by the studios in 1928. He worked with Brenon on a picture for United Artists called Lummox that starred Winifred Westover, the ex-wife of William S. Hart. As Ed Burns told me, quote, "So many silent directors were phonies. I didn't think highly of Herbert Brenon, for instance. He was the old, imperious type of director, lordly, demanding. There was a scene in Lummox where Winifred Westover was supposed to be betrayed by Ben Lyon, who's gotten her pregnant. He throws some money down, and she takes the money and tears it up with her teeth. Well, Brenon demanded real money, and several takes. The poor prop man was going around borrowing money from the crew. It was the imperial syndrome of silent film directors." Close quote. Sound demanded a more fluid grasp of drama, if not of camera effects. The ideal studio director for sound would prove to be the equivalent of a solid rep company director, someone who'd get a script up and running with a sense of pace, whether the script itself was good, bad, or indifferent, and do it on time and with a minimum of introspection. I'm thinking here of Raoul Walsh. The dramatic affectations encouraged by the essentially pictorial, plastic nature of silent filmmaking now seemed ill-judged, if not outright absurd. Brennan's troubles with sound were duplicated by Negri, a veritable catalog of misfortune. 6 months after the death of Rudolph Valentino, the man she called the love of her life, Negri married Serge Midavani, one of a group of Georgian princes. Brennan's troubles with sound were duplicated by Pola Negri, a veritable catalog of misfortune. 6 months after the death of Rudolph Valentino, Negri married Serge Midavani, one of a group of Georgian princes whose careers consisted of marrying heiresses and movie stars and then separating them from as much of their money as was possible. Serge Midavani's brother David had married Mae Murray, the star of Stroheim's The Merry Widow, and that marriage served as a blueprint for his brother's marriage to Negri. Marrying so soon after the death of the man that Negri had proclaimed the love of her life provoked a bad taste in the mouths of the fans who had liked her. Midavani hung around as long as the Paramount paychecks kept flowing and were able to finance his lavish gifts to his wife that were purchased with her money. And then came sound. Negri, like other foreign-born stars, such as Vilma Banky and Emil Jannings, had an accent, and her English was considered insufficiently articulate for American sound pictures. Negri, Banky, and Jannings were all cut loose by Hollywood studios in very short order after sound rushed in. And then Pola Negri discovered she was pregnant. She moved with her husband to a chateau in France, where she miscarried. Naturally enough, she grew depressed. In response, her husband grew restless. This was not the life he'd bargained for. The stock market crash in 1929 reduced Negri's net worth by a considerable amount, thus completing the process that Midavani had begun. They divorced, and Midavani again went on the hunt. He married an heiress. In 1936, he was playing polo in Palm Beach when his horse collided with another mount. Midavani fell off his horse, and as he was getting up, his horse kicked him in the head, and that was the end of Serge Midavani, thereby preserving the net worth of innumerable heiresses. The rest of Negri's life was basically a series of catch-as-catch-can adjustments to circumstance. The New York Times reported that the IRS was coming after her for nearly $69,000 in back taxes from 1924, 25, and 26. The truth was that Negri never recovered her finances after the marriage to Midavani. After Paramount cut her loose, she went to England, and specifically to the island of Jersey, to make a movie called The Woman He Scorned, a silent film made in 1929. Negri played a prostitute, Warwick Ward played her pimp. When Negri falls in love with a lighthouse keeper, complications ensue. There was a happy ending. It was too little too late, and it seems never to have been released in America, which is telling. She did attempt an American comeback in 1932 in a film for RKO called A Woman Commands, with Basil Rathbone as her leading man. It was designed to replicate the Negri that had made such a hit in the silent days. She played a woman who falls in love with an army captain and drops him when she finds out he's bankrupted himself to win her. She becomes a famous dancer in cabarets when a king, played by Roland Young, also falls in love with her. It was very much the mixture as before. It could easily have been made as a silent film 5 years earlier. Garbo might have been able to get away with it in 1932, but only because of her huge audience and MGM's promotional power. For Negri, the failure of A Woman Commands slammed the doors of Hollywood for 10 more years. She tried vaudeville with an act that included her singing Paradise, a song she sang in A Woman Commands. She began a relationship with Russ Columbo, a handsome crooner who was running neck and neck with Bing Crosby as America's favorite. But she broke that off, and Columbo promptly made Paradise a staple of his own nightclub act. The truth was that times had changed, and so had the nature of movie stars. If you look at the long march of movie history, the life expectancy for movie stars of this era was perhaps 10 years. Most stars of this era today, careers are longer because there are more venues. If you cease to attract audiences to theaters, a star can always transfer to TV or streaming work. And again, the Depression brought a taste for proletarian types, and Negri had been selling sultry glamour, which was now in the hands of a younger generation of actresses. Kay Francis, for instance. Gloria Swanson, Negri's chief rival at Paramount, made 5 or 6 sound pictures to no impact whatsoever. For a time, vaudeville constituted a living for Negri, but it really wasn't her natural habitat. She got a job offer from UFA in Germany for a picture called Mazurka, which was basically Madame X with a few changes to avoid a plagiarism suit. The salary on hand was $25,000, a lot less than she'd made at Paramount for a picture, but she was in no position to bargain. She was now 38 years old and prone to sipping champagne between camera setups. She was nearly forbidden to make the film because Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi arbiter of racial purity, thought she was part Jewish. Negri protested that she was Catholic, not Jewish, so she was allowed to make the picture. Surprisingly, Mazurka was a hit in Europe, and Negri hoped that the film would be remade in America, starring her. In fact, it was remade in America under the title Confession, but the star part was recast with Kay Francis. Negri made 5 more movies for UFA, which eventually led to accusations that she was a Nazi sympathizer. Probably not. Negri's true religion was Pola Negri. She sailed for America and was detained on Ellis Island because her passport had expired during the 6 years she'd been working in Europe. Once that was cleared up, she was supposedly offered the part of Pilar in Paramount's production of Hemingway's novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, but she turned it down, although an unglamorous character part might have given her career a second wind. She made another attempt at an American comeback with Hi Diddle Diddle, a semi-screwball comedy with her old co-star Adolphe Menjou that was directed by Andrew Stone with costumes by Adrian. Negri looks good, she sings quite well, and she enters into the proceedings with high spirits and good timing, although her Polish accent does require concentration on the part of the viewer. Unfortunately, the picture failed commercially, and it would be another 20 years before she went before the cameras. Marion Davies offered Negri her guest house for as long as she needed it, but after a time Negri returned to New York, where she rented a small apartment on East 90th Street. She spent most of World War II in New York City, surviving by selling off her jewelry. Pola Negri, one of the great stars of the silent era, was now just another near-indigent, middle-aged, out-of-work actress trying to survive in New York City. It was at this point that she reconnected with Margaret West, whom she'd known years before. West was a recently retired radio host with an independent income. It was Margaret West who provided Negri with a lifeline. Negri became an American citizen in 1951, and the two women lived together for the rest of West's life, first in Bel Air, later in West's hometown of San Antonio. As one friend of Negri's said, quote, Pola was a very good Catholic, went to church every Sunday and celebrated Easter. That's the one thing she took seriously. Otherwise, she did everything the Catholic Church doesn't want you to do. Margaret West died in 1963 and provided for Negri in her will. That same year, Negri went back before the cameras for the first time since Hi Diddle Diddle, when Walt Disney offered her a part in a Haley Mills vehicle entitled The Moonspinners. Negri played a roguishly entertaining jewel thief who leads a cheetah around on a leash. It was an exotic role custom-tailored for her by Disney, who had adored her silent pictures. Quote, I've survived 2 wars, 4 revolutions, and 5 marriages, Negri intones, only a slight exaggeration of her real life. With that final success behind her, Negri retired to San Antonio. She went to church every Sunday, received the key to the city, went to New York City twice a year to see friends and catch up on the latest films and plays. She lived the rest of her life there, writing a book entitled Memoirs of a Star that is possibly even more flamboyantly dramatic than her actual life. Supposedly, she was offered the part Ingrid Bergman eventually played in Vincent Minnelli's last film, A Matter of Time, but turned it down because of failing eyesight. She smoked long cigarettes, she voted Republican, she gave generously to cultural charities and to the Catholic Church. And, as before, she generally wore either black or white, never any colors. Please don't write that I'm old, she told one writer. Just say that all my dear friends are dead. When she was in the hospital during her final illness, a doctor was reading her medical chart, and he obviously didn't recognize her name. You don't know who I am? She asked. Norma Desmond couldn't have summoned any more hauteur. When Pola Negri died in August 1987, she was 90 years old. It's quite a life. She was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Los Angeles alongside her mother and Margaret West. You'll have noted the cameraman on this picture, James Howe. This, of course, is the legendary James Wong Howe. He was only 24 years old when he shot The Spanish Dancer. He was born Wong Tung Jim in China, came to America as a child, and eventually got a job in the camera department at famous Players Lasky. As he told me, it was the mandate of the studio that every camera used in production needed to be disassembled, cleaned and oiled, and then reassembled every night. What this meant in practice was the cameras being used on location or late-night shoots often didn't reach the camera department until long after the dinner hour. After Howe disassembled and reassembled each camera, it was often past 11 p.m. when the last streetcar ran. This meant that Howe had to sleep at the studio. He didn't mind. He'd find a bed on a set or in the prop room and go to sleep. Famous Players Lasky was in the heart of Hollywood amidst orange groves. Howe would wake up in the morning to the intoxicating scent of oranges. It struck him as both appropriate and enchanting. For Howe, this encapsulated the romance of the movies. The work was hard and demanding, especially if you were as single-minded as James Wong Howe, but the compensations were remarkable, and they all transcended money or prestige. Howe's genius as a cameraman was singular. Many in the industry thought he became the very best at what he did, surpassing even Greg Toland. Toland's deep focus style was not appropriate for every picture, and the pictures Toland shot in the conventional shallow focus style of the period were often indistinguishable from other top cameramen. Howe didn't really have a specific style, and he didn't really believe in a specific style. He customized his visual approach to the demands of the story and of the director. As he explained, shooting Martin Ritt's hut with the majestic landscapes of a John Ford Western would have been a catastrophic mistake. The washed-out skies of HUD gave the images a bleakness reflected by the characters and by the story. Howe became more than a camera technician by shooting stills of Mary Miles Minter, famous players Lasky's version of Mary Pickford. Minter had very light blue eyes that tended to wash out in the orthochromatic film in use at the time. Howe used a piece of black velvet for her to stare at while her close-ups were being shot. The velvet reflected in her eyes and gave them a dark cast, and Howe was immediately hailed as a young genius. He was promoted to assistant cameraman to Alvin Wyckoff on some Cecil B. DeMille pictures. Howe liked DeMille personally, but he thought he was too commercial. Howe told me that DeMille insisted to Alvin Wyckoff that he had paid a lot of money for his sets and he wanted them brightly lit so the audience could see every square inch. Howe was soon promoted to first cameraman, where he was snapped up by Herbert Brenon. You will have noted by this time that throughout The Spanish Dancer, the camera never moves. There are no tracking shots. There aren't even any panning shots. All movement of the actors and all the movement of the plot is done through either cutting or titles. It's a slightly airless style that was typical of Brenon, whose visual style could best be described as conservative. This was unusual for Hollywood heading into the mid-20s, when movies really began to move, physically as well as visually. It was a time when the camera got off the tripod and onto the dolly, but not in Herbert Brenon pictures. Shortly after The Spanish Dancer, he made Peter Pan with Betty Bronson, and after Peter Pan, he made Beau Geste with Ronald Colman. Both pictures were hugely successful, and both were made with the same utilitarian visual aesthetic. In Beau Geste, a slow tracking shot down the row of dead legionnaires propped up on the fortress wall would seem to be the obvious as well as the most visually effective choice, but Brenon contented himself with a very modest pan. Yet Jimmy Howe liked Brenon because his style somehow managed to work, and because within the limitations of his staid use of the camera, he was willing to take pains with lighting, as is shown in a lot of the photography in the castle of The Spanish Dancer. It must be pointed out that all of Brenon's pictures of this period were dramatically as well as commercially successful. Howe's photography of The Spanish Dancer is not so much ahead of its time as it is a perfect example of high-end lighting of its time, a style that would soon be altered by the next iteration of visual style brought to America by F.W. Murnau. Despite Brennan's temperament, James Wong Howe was quite fond of him. Of course, within the industry, Jimmy was also thought to have been distinctly tempestuous temperament. As far as Jimmy was concerned, it was just a function of what amounted to his perfectionism. They maintained their friendship all of Brennan's life. Howe told me that in the 1950s, Brenon was completely forgotten and living in a small apartment on Santa Monica Boulevard. Howe would occasionally visit him and bring lunch for two. Howe had just come through a bad period of his own, when he was gray-listed during the McCarthy era because of his marriage to Sonora Babb, a Caucasian woman novelist with radical political sympathies. His wife's politics were bad enough, but the fact that they were a biracial couple, at a time when biracial couples were exceedingly rare, was almost certainly a contributing factor for Howe's professional difficulties. So James Wong Howe, who no less than Joan Crawford considered the best of all Hollywood cameramen, went through a period of taking what movies he could get. If that meant 10-day quickies, so be it. To keep some money coming in during fallow periods, Jimmy opened a Chinese restaurant, which turned out to be quite successful for a number of years. At any rate, by 1955, Howe had worked his way back to the big time, with movies such as Picnic for Joshua Logan, who needed a good cameraman more than most directors. When Howe would come to visit Brenon, the old director was writing his memoirs, of which only one chapter survives. Brenon gave every indication of being yet another embittered Hollywood relic, of the sort that Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett imagined for Sunset Boulevard. Howe thought that Brenon was more or less broke, but he must have been mistaken. When Brenon died in 1958, he was buried in a private, above-ground stone tomb at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Of course, maybe Howe was right after all. Maybe Brenon had paid for his tomb years before, when he was flush with jobs and flush with money. We'll never know. It's careers such as Brennon's that make movie history so fascinating, and it's movies like The Spanish Dancer that make the lives of the people that made them still relevant 100 years later. There's a lot of the June Mathis script in The Spanish Dancer. Notice how Negri tends to disappear in the latter part of the film, which would have been the case had it been a Valentino vehicle as was originally planned. Also, although there are sword fights and suggestions of rape, the performances are played lightly, and that can be attributable to Brenon as well as to the June Mathis script. In particular, Antonio Moreno plays his part with a perceptible air of tongue-in-cheek. Errol Flynn before Errol Flynn. This sets it apart from Mary Pickford's film of the same story, which is structured as a Pickford vehicle, pure and simple. And George Walsh, her leading man, vanishes from the film for long periods. At the end of The Spanish Dancer, guile and deceit are vanquished. Love triumphs, and let's face it, that's one of the main attractions of the movies, whether it's 1923 or 2023. As you may have gathered, most American critics didn't really know what to make of Pola Negri. I think she was too overtly sexual, too exotic. In Russia, a young writer named Alicia Rosenbaum had a better eye and instincts than most. She'd come to America and become known as Ayn Rand, the proponent of an unfortunately influential philosophy that became known as objectivism. She always loved movies, and she seems to have understood Pola Negri. This is Ayn Rand writing in 1926. Pola Negri is atypical. She cannot be stereotyped. She is Pola Negri only. Among the mass of tender, smiling, syrupy, sweet little faces of the American and other movie heroines, each identical to the other like lozenges from the same box, the gloomy, cruel face of Pola Negri stands out and imprints itself in one's memory for a long time. Her type is not the fragile, virtuous maiden, not the empty stereotype of sentimental American dramas. Her type is the proud woman conqueror, often a tragic one, but powerful even in her suffering. Her heroines exemplify everything in a woman's character, which is strong, insolent, occasionally crafty, and always victorious. Pola Negri always portrays the strong, powerful woman. Her heroines are scattered around the globe. Pola Negri is international. She's able to portray every social class and nationality, equally colorfully and convincingly. A Spanish woman, an ancient Egyptian, a modern-day French woman, a child of the people, a worldly noblewoman. This great actress is equally good at each of these roles. This is one of the reasons for her universal success. I couldn't put it any better. On behalf of James Wong Howe, Herbert Brenon, and Pola Negri, this is Scott Iman, thanking you for your time and for your interest in The Spanish Dancer.
My name is Naima Prevost, Professor Emerita at American University in Washington, D.C. I was on faculty there for 36 years, and over time served as chair of the Department of Performing Arts and director of dance. My book, Dancing in the Sun, was the first to cover the history of several major choreographers in Hollywood and Los Angeles from 1915 to 1937. And I am here to talk about one of the dance artists and teachers I wrote about, Ernest Belcher. But I think you will first be interested in how I discovered and wrote about Belcher, his pioneering work in films and in American dance and ballet. My husband was working in Los Angeles, and I took a 2-year leave of absence from the university. He kept talking about the Hollywood Bowl, how wonderful it was, and what amazing performances took place there with large audiences of over 18,000 people. Well, I started digging for information and discovered that the Los Angeles Philharmonic ran the Hollywood Bowl. I set up meetings with Ernest Fleischman, who at that time in 1979 headed the orchestra. Two things happened. I got access to the Los Angeles Philharmonic archives, and I suggested a museum at the Hollywood Bowl, which would celebrate the accomplishments of the artists who performed at the Bowl. I was successful in creating the museum, which still exists there. And so, back to Ernest Belcher. It turned out he was a pivotal figure in the early movie industry and an equally important figure in the development of American ballet. And now, I'm delighted to share my discoveries with you and celebrate his contributions to the Spanish dancer. Pola Negri, the vibrant female lead of the Spanish dancer, wrote a letter to Ernest Belcher in 1924, expressing her feelings about working with him as the dance sequences were created and performed. Quote, "My dear Mr. Belcher, it is with warm appreciation that I write these few lines of a happy association with Mr. Belcher while planning the dances which are so in evidence in my latest picture, The Spanish Dancer. Quiet and unassuming, yet an artist showing strength and decision in his work, backed by a technique of unusual excellence, a studio reflecting refinement and happiness, one can easily find the reason for his popularity and success, both in the theatrical picture world, developing talent which in short time is undoubtedly going to place Los Angeles in the front ranks as Mecca of the dance. A continued success for such a conscientious effort is the wish of Pola Negri," end quote. Who was Ernest Belcher? His name is not on the original list of those involved in this film, and his name was also not included in other silent films where his choreography was an essential part of the movie. The dance scenes and dances in The Spanish Dancer are vibrant and important in our visual and narrative experience. Belcher is masterful in his ability to have Negri as the gypsy Maritana dance with softness and power at the same time. Her dances are virtuoso in a quiet way, as her torso, feet, head, hands move with clarity and determination, but also make her part of the total scene. Her dances have clear Spanish roots, but tell us she also has the freedom of her gypsy origins and not the formality that might exist with a professional flamenco dancer. The groups of dancers who perform with her are arranged in fairly simple patterns, but in ways that allow the camera to capture their grace and flow and the sense we get of their pleasure in moving and our ease in watching. Belcher's choreography is completely integrated into the narrative surrounding the various characters and holds its own, but also highlights the various scenes of the Count, the King, the Queen, and the festival crowds. In The Spanish Dancer, Pola Negri and Ernest Belcher were a good combination. Born in Poland as a young person, she auditioned and was accepted into the Warsaw Imperial Ballet. She made major appearances there in the ballet Swan Lake and Coppelia, but when she became ill with tuberculosis, that ended her dance career. After recovering from her illness, she entered the Warsaw Academy of Dramatic Arts and became an actress. When World War I broke out, the theater in Warsaw was no longer an option for her, and she turned to films. She went to Berlin, where she worked with Ernst Lubitsch, and their partnership was very successful. In 1922, both were awarded Hollywood contracts. When Belcher worked with her in 1923 on this film, he clearly found her dance background very valuable and utilized it very effectively. Negri performs in the film with the poise and knowledge of someone who was well trained in dance and knew how to communicate in movement. Her early training in ballet was compatible with Belcher's background, and we sense a high level of comfort as Negri performs and truly becomes a Spanish gypsy dancer. Again, who was Ernest Belcher? Why, this is his only silent movie? How many did he do, and what else did he do? Did he indeed have a role in the idea of Los Angeles as a mecca of the dance, as noted by Pola Negri? And why do very few know about him today, in spite of his numerous accomplishments? Belcher was a teacher, choreographer, and mentor to many in Hollywood from 1915 through the 1940s. Many were his students at various times, and here are some names in no particular order: Maria and Marjorie Tallchief, Shirley Temple, Rita Hayworth, Sid Charisse, Nanette Fabray, Paul Godkin, Rod Alexander, Rosita Moreno, Gwen Verdon, Carmelita Marachi, Lauren Hightower, June Roper, Marge Champion, Gower Champion. That is a list of dancers who studied with him. Many actors also came to him for training in movement and assistance with dances, among them Mary Pickford, Pola Negri, John Barrymore, Ramon Novero, John Gilbert, Marion Davies, Ruby Keeler, Betty Grable, Ida Lupino, Yvonne DiCarlo. He was the choreographer for many silent movies, created many ballets for the Hollywood Bowl, and had thousands of students in his studios over the many years he taught. Let us look at who Belcher was throughout his career and life. Ernest Belcher was born in London's Chelsea district, June 8, 1882, and as a youth had no exposure to theater or dance. His father was a butcher, and as a youngster he worked in the shop and sang in the church choir. In school, he developed an interest in painting, architecture, and music, and began going to orchestral concerts at Royal Albert Hall. In unpublished autobiographical notes, he wrote, quote, "When the music had ceased and I again found myself, I would realize that I had been living through a great sensation of rhythmic form, and thus seemed to move a step forward in the linking of music and rhythm. About this time, there was a sudden realization that this expression of myself in gesture and movement was to be a great dominating force in my life, and I was immediately ready to sacrifice almost anything and everything to attain success in this art," unquote. In 1898, 16 years old and determined to find out about dance, Belcher began searching for a teacher. A young person wanting to study dance seriously was at a great disadvantage in England during the late 19th century and the early years of the 20th. No school or permanent company existed where the ballet traditions were nurtured and handed down from generation to generation, as was true in Russia, France, and Denmark. Teachers were primarily interested in preparing their students, most of them women, for the popular theater. Ernest Belcher began his study of dance with Ethel Payne, a member of the Go Bang Girls, 4 women who performed in music halls. Belcher's family disapproved of the new direction in his life, but he persisted. He sought out Francesca Zanfredi, who had danced at the Empire Theater and was known as a fine teacher. At that time, Belcher also left his parents' home, took odd jobs, and often spent money intended for food, car fare, and laundry on his ballet lessons. In his biographical notes, he wrote about this period, quote, "It became necessary to deprive myself of everything except the barest necessities of life in order to pay for my lessons. This I did for 2 years, with little or no encouragement from anyone except a few close friends, and even they doubted that anything of value would be the outcome of my efforts." Dance had become Ernest Belcher's passion, and he started taking lessons with Alexander Genet, who came from a distinguished ballet family. Realizing that survival as a dancer would mean the ability to perform in music halls and on vaudeville circuits, he sought out other teachers to gain expertise in a variety of dance forms. He studied period and national dances, folk dances, Spanish dances, Indian and Eastern Oriental dances. In 1909, at the age of 27, he made his debut at the famous Alhambra Theatre in London as part of a revue. In 1910, he got a job in the famous Haymarket Theatre in London in a production of the work by Maurice Maeterlinck, The Blue Bird. He stayed with this production for 17 months, touring the entire British Isles. He then went on to head his own acts on the music hall circuit, and through 1914 he had performing arts partnerships with several women. One of the more important facets of his career between 1910 and 1914 was his early involvement with films. For the Celsua Motion Picture Company of London, he created a series of dance scenes. Ernest Belcher was ready for new adventures by 1914, and he joined a group called the Golden Dancers, which was preparing to tour America. The group arrived in New York sometime in August 1914, just as World War I was breaking out in Europe. Belcher seems to have made the decision not to return to England shortly after arriving in this country. His main source of employment after working with the Golden Dancers during late 1914 and part of 1915 was an engagement with the Keith Orpheum Circuits to present his own act. During this period of time, he became ill with tuberculosis and decided to leave New York and go to Southern California. There were two major factors in this decision, which was to become a significant turning point in his life. The weather was better for his illness, and having worked with movies in London, he was intrigued by the idea of being in Hollywood and trying to work with movies there. He arrived in Los Angeles in 1915, and by May 1916 had opened his first school with 5 students, as he wrote later, remembering that, quote, "There were 2 who paid and 3 who did not," unquote. He also managed to cure himself from tuberculosis. According to his daughter Marge Champion, he rented a room on the 2nd floor of a small apartment building. Here he built a platform from the window to the tree in the yard and slept on this every night. Somehow this worked. and the tuberculosis was gone. When Belcher arrived in Los Angeles at the age of 33, it is likely that he began to dream of a more stable existence and saw possibilities in both teaching and working for the new film industry. He had a vision for American ballet: systematic graded training, respectability for male dancers, an educated lay public, careful training and refresher courses for teachers, the possibilities for ballet in movies, and a ballet company of American dancers. His teaching and film work became intertwined. Movie stars flocked to his studios for training and coaching, and parents sent their children based on his growing reputation. There were many reasons for Belcher's success and the large following he attracted as a teacher. For serious students, he offered the opportunity of a systematic graded training and the financial incentive of movie work. Directors turned to him with great regularity, not only to create the dance sequences for films using his own students, but also as a source of dancers for a variety of production numbers, as well as extras, stand-ins, and on occasion stunt performers. Movie stars came to his classes and hired him for private lessons, as he had the ability to train them quickly, both in ballet fundamentals and in the specific requirements of a particular movie or dance sequence. Men were encouraged to come to Belcher's studio for ballet training by the special men's classes he had, and because he was able to find them employment in films and movie prologues. Belcher began working for the movies in 1918 and was soon doing well financially. By 1922, he was able to build his own studio building. This facility, located at 634 West 15th Street in Los Angeles, housed a large studio of 3,600 square feet, as well as a balcony for stage mothers. There was an adjoining hall with a stage and excellent dressing rooms and costume facilities. By 1928, Belcher had over 2,000 students, a faculty teaching tap, acrobatics, physical culture, modern dance, hula, ballroom, and Spanish dance, and a business manager. Among the better-known associates at the Belcher studio over the years were Elisa Eduardo and Gabriel Cancino, who taught Spanish dance and enrolled the youngest member of the family, Margarita, later known as Rita Hayworth, in Belcher's ballet classes. Belcher was so well known and so important to the movie and dance communities that in 1931, Cecil B. DeMille built him a 3-story studio of 36,000 square feet, located at 607 Southwestern Avenue in Los Angeles. Belcher had worked on many films with DeMille, and the school was valuable as a source of dancers and as a place to send actors for coaching and training. Belcher occupied the studio until 1955, at which time it changed hands. That studio still exists and is now the Westmore Dance Studio, focusing on a large range of ballroom dance. Belcher's work developed as Los Angeles and the film industry grew. In 1910, Hollywood was a tiny village of just over 3,000 residents when it was incorporated into the small city of Los Angeles, population 319,198. In 1911, the first movie studio was created in Hollywood by the Horsley brothers. In 1915, the important American dance innovators Ted Shawn and Ruth St. Denis opened their Denishawn School, and great dance artists such as Martha Graham came there as young students. Gradually, other choreographers and teachers came to Los Angeles. Theodore Kozlov, who had worked with the impresario Serge Diaghilev, made his first movie in 1917 and opened a school in 1919. Other great ballet dancers arrived in Los Angeles later. Serge Ukrainsky opened a school in Los Angeles in 1927 and Adolf Bum in 1928. Two individuals developing other ideas in dance soon also arrived, Lester Horton in 1928 and Michio Ito in 1929. Making money in the movies was an attractive idea, and housing and land were cheap. Belcher was not without competition, but his reputation kept growing. There were three components: the rigorous and wide-ranging training in his studio, his work in the movies, and the choreography he began doing for large audiences at the Hollywood Bowl in 1922 and continued through 1934. Ernest Belcher's involvement with Hollywood films began in 1918 when he worked with Cecil B. DeMille on We Can't Have Everything, produced by famous players Lasky. According to newspaper articles on Belcher written when his large studio was opened, by 1931 he had been involved in over 200 movies. Belcher's film work ranged from instructing actors how to behave in a way appropriate to the period, such as how to bow in Regency style for Beau Brummel in 1924, starring John Barrymore, to extended dance sequences, as in The Spanish Dancer in 1923, and in 1925, Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney. Belcher also staged the dance numbers for The Jazz Singer in 1927, the movie that spelled the end for silent films and revolutionized the industry. After 1930, the only films on which he is known for certain to have worked were the Greta Garbo Frederick March Anna Karenina in 1935 and Shirley Temple's Little Princess in 1939. For Temple, he staged a full dance sequence, and for the Garbo March film, he seems to have been primarily a movement coach. It is surprising and sad that Belcher was not given public credit for his work on The Spanish Dancer. Even a recent search for credits showed his name lacking. Belcher brought to this movie his range of abilities in working with dance and film in terms of wide levels of training and ability for the various performers and knowledge of what camera and movement combinations work best. He created movements for Pola Negri that clearly have Spanish roots and also a gypsy feeling. Her torso bends and twists with clarity and elegance, and her feet tap the floor in simple but defined patterns. He achieves both a sense of discipline and abandon in her dances. And although she's often surrounded by many in the dance scenes, Belcher placed her in space so that we could always see her clearly, and the others provide a contrapuntal background. The movements for the groups of dancers are simple but strong. The spatial patterns that Belcher establishes are meant to work with various camera angles. The dances in the silent films Souls for Sale, 1923, Phantom of the Opera, 1925, the mixed silent and talkie The Jazz Singer, 1927, and General Crack, 1929, John Barrymore's first sound film, provide examples of the range and style of Belcher's movie work. In all of them, the dance sequences are relatively short, but important in terms of advancing the action of the movie. The dancing is technically high in quality and filmed to get maximum impact. Belcher's versatility is clearly in evidence, but at no time is there a sacrifice of integrity or historical accuracy. For Souls for Sale, directed by Rupert Hughes, Belcher created 3 dance sequences that show the wide variety of dance numbers he was called on to stage for films. The first takes place in a music hall. The few women seen on the stage are somewhat seedy, but do their kicks and turns quite competently. The 3 watching the show are all crooks, trying to outwit one another by each claiming to be something they are not, and the music hall scene illuminates their shabbiness. The next dance scene in this movie takes place in an elegant restaurant where there is social dancing. Eleanor Broadband, as the heroine, whose first name is Remember, has just become a famous movie star. As the fashionably dressed dancers foxtrot, the importance of the occasion and the social status the heroine has achieved are established. In the last part of Souls for Sale, Remember is seen playing a circus performer, doing a sequence of backbends, turns, and promenades appropriate to her role. In one of the most famous films in which Belcher worked, Phantom of the Opera, directed by Rupert Hughes, starring Lon Chaney, there are 2 ballet sequences. These occur on stage at the Paris Opera as the action is seen unfolding in both the auditorium and behind the scenes. Each time the large corps de ballet is shown, it helps to establish the sense of the Paris Opera as a large and fashionable theater. The dancing is not complicated, consisting mostly of the corps doing simple unison movements, either side to side or forward and backward. But the camera has captured all of the bodies, and the effect is strong. In 1925, the newspaper publicity heralded these sequences as the most spectacular ballet dancing ever seen in movies. Given the history of dance in Hollywood films at this point in time, the presentation of a formal ballet segment with no excuses and no frills was important. Belcher made other contributions to this film. There's a great deal of group movement and exceptionally telling gestural activity. The young women who appeared in the ballet appear in various parts of the film, helping to further the story. They are participants in an extended scene in which Phantom of the Opera is being chased through the opera house and the catacombs, and their movements are choreographed to convey a wide assortment of emotional qualities: hope, fear, excitement. Belcher's trained eye for movement is very much in control here, and he was also responsible for a subsequent scene when the Phantom reappears in the opera house. Large groups of people mill around the grand staircase, groupings are carefully choreographed, and there are even well-placed segments of dancing revelry that provide much of the feeling the director wanted to convey. In The Jazz Singer, much of the film was silent, but there was a pre-recorded score, and Belcher created 4 dance scenes, utilizing his knowledge of vaudeville and popular theater. The vaudeville routine, showing a girl's kick line on a shallow stage set, featured the star Mae McAvoy in a short solo on point, ending with a Harriet Hoctor-like backward beret on point, which clearly establishes the character's talent, but also the rather shabby conditions of vaudeville. Although beginning with a conventional chorus rehearsal routine, the Broadway show numbers are more elaborate. In a rehearsal sequence, McAvoy does high kicks in front of a line of kicking chorus girls, then leaps into the arms of the chorus boys, who lift her triumphantly. The last number shows the chorus in a, quote, tennis anyone, unquote, routine, which they reprise with croquet mallets. Throughout the film, Belcher follows conventional vaudeville and Broadway styles, but he is also helping to establish the pattern for stage dance and rehearsal scenes in the flood of backstage musicals that followed the introduction of sound in The Jazz Dancer. As a result of such imitations, these numbers look more routine to modern audiences than they would have seemed to audiences in 1927. General Crack, directed by Alan Crosland, shows Belcher working with very different material, this time using both humor and satire. During the first dance scene in the movie, set in a cafe, John Barrymore, as Prince Christian, known as General Crack, meets a future love, a fiery, sensual gypsy called Fidelia and played by Armida, a Mexican actress. She performs a Spanish dance. The steps of this solo are designed to show her wit, elegance, sensuality, and passion, and thus give credibility to the ensuing scenes of love, betrayal, and revenge. The action in General Crack later moves to the Archduke's Ballroom in Brussels, and we are given a sense of the grand late 18th century environment through Belcher's staging of a large number of couples dancing the minuet. Marion Nixon as the General's other love, the Archduchess Maria Louise, and Laurel Sherman as Ludwig are shown in their aristocratic milieu. In a later ballroom scene, Belcher staged a large number of couples dancing a minuet. In a second ballroom scene, Belcher wittily focuses on a stout, elderly couple who, as they dance, show us their slyness and delight in intrigue by their gestures. Although Barrymore is not involved in any dancing, it seems probable that Belcher coached him in the correct ways of walking, bowing, and standing in a style appropriate to the period. Belcher's work with Shirley Temple attracted a great deal of attention. In 1938, Darryl Zanuck, head of 20th Century Fox, sent her to Belcher for private lessons. His school catalog from that year had a long article about his private lessons with Shirley Temple at her home. Quote, significant of the high esteem in which Ernest Belcher is held by the motion picture industry is the fact that Mr. Darrell Zanuck, Chief Executive Officer of the 20th Century Fox Film Corporation, has entrusted to his careful guidance the professional dance training of the delightful little star Shirley Temple. Mr. Belcher arrives at the Temple residence at 8:30 each morning, and ballet claims Shirley's immediate attention. But work, center practice, positions of the hands and feet, graceful movements of the hands, and back bends comprise the first half of the lesson, gradually developing into little dance steps which she adores. There is one approving spectator always in attendance at Shirley's lessons, and he is Ching Ching, her pet Pekingese, who sits sedately on his chair, his eyes following every movement of his little mistress with doggish concern. On one occasion, when he seemed particularly engrossed in her work, Shirley smiled at Mr. Belcher and said, quote, Ching Ching is fascinated with my feet, unquote. Another school catalog from 1938 featured a drawing by Shirley Temple of a dancer executing a pirouette and the information that Shirley was awarded a certificate upon her successful completion of the third grade work in the Belcher School. Apparently, Belcher felt little Shirley's training required more than just teaching her steps, and we are told, quote, an increased enthusiasm about her dancing was displayed by Shirley after she accompanied her parents and Mr. Belcher to a performance of the Ballet Russe last season, unquote. The first time Shirley Temple's work was shown on screen was on February 17, 1939, in the press preview of her first Technicolor film, The Little Princess. In the dream fantasy sequence, in which the impoverished and ill-treated little princess visualizes herself dancing with the ballet, 16 of Belcher's students functioned as the core around her, dressed in filmy white with gold wigs and bouffant skirts. After his work with Shirley Temple, Belcher was no longer active as a movie choreographer and dance director. There were probably many reasons for this. The movies were now talkies, and the studios began hiring Broadway dance directors like Albertina Rausch, Busby Berkeley, and Sammy Lee for their musicals. Belcher had no interest in expending the energy necessary to compete against these people. In addition, there were new teachers and choreographers active in Los Angeles who were very interested in film work as a good source of income. Lester Horton, Michio Ito, Serge Ukransky, Theodor Kozlov, Benjamin Zemach, Adolf Bohm. According to his stepdaughter, Lena Basquet, and his daughter, Marge Champion, Belcher was not a publicity grabber. He was not involved in sordid affairs, in Hollywood partying, or in egotistical displays, and he refused to claw his way to the top or to play political games. It was no accident that Belcher's movie dance sequences were effective, for he had given a great deal of thought to the differences between stage and screen. Special attention had to be paid to movement that was under the scrutiny of the camera. Although dance seemed an exciting medium for film, at the beginning of the growth of Hollywood's film industry, many dancers at that time made only sporadic attempts to use the medium inventively. Belcher stuck with it for a long time, perhaps because of the determination that came from his early background and temperament. It was not always easy working with various movie directors. His stepdaughter, Lena Basquet, noted, quote, many of them thought they were the reincarnation of Jesus, unquote. Movie-making conditions in those days were very primitive. Long hours, dirty bathrooms, less than perfect space, and often impatient, antagonistic attitudes on the part of the directors. By the late 1930s, Belcher was happily settled into a routine, and his studio was enormously successful. As a teacher, he only had to answer to himself and could set his own standards. Despite the large numbers of students who flocked to his studio, throughout his teaching career, Belcher maintained a consistently high level of expectation. By 1922, he was already known for the disciplined and sequential training offered through his 8-grade system. There are different training methods in ballet, such as those based on the teachings of Agripina Vaganova and Enrico Cicchetti. These are different ways of organizing and presenting ballet material. Belcher was trained by teachers who followed the methods established by Italian dancer and ballet master Enrico Cicchetti, and he based his own teaching on the same methods, although he also brought in other teaching ideas. In America, there is a Cicchetti Council, which supervises those who want to use that methodology through syllabi and testing. If the student in Belcher's studio came to class several times a week, the 8th-grade course could be finished in 4 years. There was also a postgraduate course that was meant to take a year and give professional finishing touches. Teachers were not neglected in Belcher's campaign to improve and develop ballet in America. A very important part of his work was the Teacher's Normal course, held every summer for 1 month. Teachers came from all over the country to participate and learn. A significant facet of Belcher's pedagogical work was his concern with making dance an acceptable vocation or avocation for men. He had special classes for boys and men and allowed them to take part in the women's classes when ready. He also wanted to educate the lay public. With this in mind, he published ballet lessons both in the daily newspaper and in a small book of his own. In 1924, the Los Angeles Record published 21 consecutive lessons for the interest of the general public. In 1927, Belcher published his own Basic Principles of Dancing, a book of 23 progressive lessons. In a 1935 radio interview, he talked about ballet and invited questions from the audience. In 1931-32, he wrote a monthly series about ballet and teaching in The American Dancer. Ernest Belcher closed his studio in 1955 at the age of 73, having mentored, taught, and directed several generations of students. In 1965, when he was 83, Belcher was honored at a special ceremony. In attendance were the dance innovator Ruth St. Denis and Belcher's daughter Marge Champion with her then-husband Gower Champion, who had gone on to significant Broadway fame. He never forgot Belcher's influence on him and recalled how his life had been changed by this man, who was his teacher, mentor, and father-in-law. Quote, "I first met Mr. Belcher when I was 13 years old. He had seen me do a ballroom dance in a school production at Bancroft Junior High. He said to my mother at the time, 'That boy should study seriously. He has it.' And for the rest of my life to now and beyond, I have had it and him as two of the touchstones of my life. Proud, erect, autocratic, mischievous, I can see him now in movement, in my heart," unquote. It is interesting to note in watching The Spanish Dancer and reviewing his accomplishments that in 1925, Belcher was given the title Dance Director of Movieland. In 1986, while writing my book and gathering research about Belcher, I corresponded with his stepdaughter, Lena Basquet. In finishing this presentation, it is fitting to quote her memories. Quote, "It is not difficult to remember that my stepfather, Ernest Belcher, was one of the gentlest human beings I have ever known. He hardly ever raised his well-modulated voice and spoke with a British accent that matched his impeccable manners and was rather an oddity in those early days in raw and rowdy Hollywood during the first quarter of this century. Because Ernest was not the type to push and shove, would not play the Tinseltown game of chicanery and underworld tactics. He never achieved the renown that he richly deserved as a choreographer and producer of magnificent dance sequences. I firmly believe that if Ernest had taken on the exotic Russian label and played the social scene of the Golden Age, wildlife of Garo Gunch and Burbank Bacchanalia, he would have become more famous and monetarily successful. Ernest Belcher made enormous contributions to dance in America, both in his movie work and in his teaching. We are fortunate to see the work of Ernest Belcher in The Spanish Dancer, and many thanks go to all those involved in restoring this wonderful movie.